Welcome to the Buff Show. Today we have the Kerrigan duo in here,
How's it going?
Hey.
Michaela and Cade, and we're going to go over pulling permits. So this is something we've been running into quite frequently when you have a house, an existing house, and they do a remodel, an addition, any kind of work that is more structural, or like plumbing or electrical that might require like a licensed contractor. When do you pull a permit, and like what are we seeing with these deals right now?
So, the biggest thing, I guess, the most general way, safest way to go about it is anything that is going to be buried in the wall or is going to be unseen that might require an inspector to look at it to qualify the work that it's done safely and it's done right. You probably should look at pulling permits. Every county is going to have different rules on what needs to be permitted and what doesn't need to be permitted. And there are certain things that as a homeowner that you can do on your own property without pulling permits. So that would be something, if you're interested in doing something to your property, remodel, addition, whatever it is, pull up your county guidelines. It should be on the county's website. They'll tell you bullet points, what needs to be permitted and what doesn't. And that can be basically the first step you could take. But
yeah. So like, what are the pros and cons when we can go from experience? Michaela has a story of a deal that she recently ran into earlier this year.
It was earlier this year out in Salt Lake, and I was representing the buyers. The sellers of this property actually weren't even the ones that did the remodel. It was the previous sellers. So these sellers we were working with bought the house that they had enclosed the garage, and they didn't pull any permits. And how we found it was the siding was actually all the way to the cement that was there before the driveway, and the inspector found it. And so when we got digging, it said there weren't permits pulled, and my clients actually ended up backing out because they got concerned about like insurance issues, if insurance would cover if anything were to happen to the home, and just like, was it done right?
Yeah.
So,
And the sellers were like, we didn't even do this. It's been fine.
Yeah.
So what's the big deal?
yeah, they didn't see any issues with it.
Yeah. But your clients were like, no, this is a big deal for us.
And they were first-time home buyers, so they're definitely like trying to do their best to do their due diligence. And
for sure.
yeah.
What about you, Cade?
So we got a deal that we're working on, and it's tough. It puts you in a tough spot. When you're dealing with permits, you got to deal with the county, and you got to deal with jumping through all the hoops that are required by them. And then that could, if you're doing a remodel or an addition on a property, the county very well could come in and say, you need to fix everything else on the property that was already existing and get that up to code, or needs to be spec'd out and inspected, and they could force you to change existing things that's already on the property. But we're kind of running into a similar situation. There was an addition done on a property kind of out in the middle of an area that's pretty rural. And
the country. Nobody pulls permits.
So pulling permits is pretty rare, but you get a buyer who's from somewhere else, and pulling permits is very common and expected. They have a big concern on the property, and so they're wanting permits pulled. And then so you got to figure out if is it, as the seller, is it worth it to go back and backtrack and try and pull permits to get things done right, or what's the consequences of doing that, or is it worth to keep it on the market and see if you can find a buyer who doesn't care if there's permits pulled?
Well, not even if they were done right, just because the guy that did the permits is a contractor and knows what he's doing. But people want, the reason behind pulling a permit is you have a third party come out and inspect it and make sure that, hey, these are to code, and then they check it off with the city, it's recorded and just documented, and like, there it is, hey, the remodel or addition was done and all the work was done to code. Because the second you sheetrock and carpet and paint, like, nobody knows
what's behind the walls.
What kind of walls, like, what kind of wire did they use? Was the plumbing good? Like, is it going to start on fire? Are there issues? So, and like, I've done a few flips in different projects, and I guess first off, I'll just start off by saying it's probably always better to be safe than sorry. There have been projects I've pulled permits on, and it's cost me a lot more money than I thought, because they make you do a bunch of other stuff that you're like, well, this doesn't really make sense, or, why are you having me do this? Like, especially if you're pulling a permit on an older house that was built like before 1950 or like there's just a lot of stuff in there that they could be like, hey, if you touch anywhere around this room, then you have to update everything to the new code. And so it can really like screw you over pretty fast, because maybe your intention was just to fix this one thing, but because you pulled a permit, then you end up having to fix all these other things. So that's why people try and avoid it, thinking like, well, I'll just do this one thing right, and then the other stuff, there's thousands of homes just like this with the same stuff, so why does it matter? But the second you involve the city or the county,
Right.
like they're gonna make a bigger deal out of it. So that's like the cons to pulling a permit. But then when you go to sell, like, yeah, you save some money by not pulling a permit, but if you get a buyer that digs into it, and disclosure is another big thing, because the new disclosure forms, the seller's disclosure forms, ask you if there's any unpermitted work on the property. And if you know that there is unpermitted work that you didn't pull a permit on, and you say no, like then you're even more liable if something goes wrong.
Yeah,
So-
disclose for sure.
So you always want to disclose. So it's kind of this double-edged sword, and I don't even know if we have the right answer, other than like, because we're professionals, like we probably should say like, yeah, it's probably best just to go by the book and
Yeah.
pull the permits, and then at the end of the transactions, you're like, or the start of a transaction, you're like, hey, here's all the work that was done on the house, permits were pulled, work was done correctly, here's photos. Like that just gives a buyer way more peace of mind. Oh yeah, my uncle came and helped me frame it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all this other stuff. It's like, it gives buyers more reason to question the job. So.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. It takes more time and money up front, but when you go to sell it, like it's just so much smoother.
Yeah.
So
But I will admit, like, I have some rentals that, like, oh, we moved a drain, and like, I may or may not have pulled a permit, but like, I wasn't planning on selling it either. But if I do go to sell it, like, that will be something that I need to disclose.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, do you guys have any other thoughts or takes or advice for people in this tricky situation?
I just think like the biggest thing is going to be looking into it before you even start.
Yeah.
Decide what your process is going to be, how you're going to go about it, and accept like, okay, when I sell this, I might have issues, and I'm going to have to find the person that doesn't care.
Right.
I think that's going to be your biggest thing, like deciding up front.
You'll never know kind of what life might throw at you. You know, you might think a property is a property you're going to be in forever, but it might not be. And so if you're okay with taking the risk of selling a property without permits pulled and maybe letting it sit till you find the buyer that doesn't mind,
Yeah.
or if you'd rather just have a nice smooth transaction and kind of have any buyer who comes through, you got all the evidence that you need and proof to show that this was done right and it was done well and it was, inspected, and just to give them peace of mind. And you might be able to charge a little bit more for that specific property because it is, permitted and
Yeah.
it's done right.
I'm glad you said that, because like, think about from a listing process, if you have a seller come to you and they're like, hey, I want to list my house, we did this big addition, but we have all the documentation, permits pulled, photos, we can create like this big memorandum of like, here's the house, here's all the permits, include that in all of our marketing, and then it's just like easy,
Yeah.
But
And-
sometimes it's better, I don't know, it's tricky. I've often thought in like marketing properties, well, what if on our houses, on our listings, like we did like radon tests and meth and like all these tests up front, and then just basically handed those to the buyer and like, here's what you're getting.
Yeah.
But there's like risk to that because you're like, well, what if we do the meth test
you
and it
find
comes back
things.
positive, and maybe another buyer wouldn't have done a meth test. So sometimes ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
And I guess it's the same thing with permits. Like, it just depends on the risk you're willing to take.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we wanted to give you guys a quick overview on some of the challenges and hurdles with permits, and hopefully it helps you guys in your decision-making process as you do those remodels or projects on your house, like if you should pull a permit or not. So
Awesome.
Be
thanks
aware.
for joining, guys.
Thank you.